Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for A&P1 students at Madison Area Technical College. This is our first organ system, and it's the integumentary system. We will mainly focus on the skin. This first lecture is an introduction to the skin and the organ system in general. So the organs of the integumentary system, of course, include the skin, and there's a picture of the skin in the upper right. There are also accessory organs related to the skin. Cutaneous glands. Cutaneous refers to the skin. These glands include sweat glands and sebaceous glands. In addition, deep within the skin are sensory receptors for things like temperature and touch, pressure, tickle, that kind of thing. Other accessory organs of the integumentary system are the hair and nails, which are not part of your study question. So we're going to start off talking about the skin and its layers. The uppermost layer, or most superficial layer of the skin, is called the epidermis. The epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, which we'll discuss in a moment. Beneath the epidermis is the dermis. The dermis contains connective tissue. Beneath the skin is a layer of tissue that we refer to as the hypodermis. Hypo meaning beneath the skin. So technically it's not part of the skin, but we often include it because there are blood vessels running through there and adipose. And it's relevant to talk about when we discuss things like burns. So the first topic within skin structure would be the histology, or the tissues that we see. The epidermis, as I mentioned, is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. The cells, which are shown as pink here, this layer right there, are called keratinocytes or keratinocytes. I've heard it pronounced both ways. The dermis, which is underneath and always thicker than the epidermis, is shown in blue, and it has two general layers. One layer includes these ridges that kind of punctuate the epidermis. This is called the papillary layer, and the ridges form our fingerprints. And the structure of the ridges, or the pattern of the ridges, is unique for every individual. This papillary layer contains loose connective tissue. So that's the layer that has some elastic fibers in it. Beneath that, we see the reticular layer, and it's also connective tissue proper, but this time it's dense versus loose. There will be some regions that appear like regular dense connective tissue, but for the most part, the pattern of the fibers is irregular. So it's mainly composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. So one thing to notice right up front is that the epidermis is always thinner than the dermis. Now, the functions of the integumentary system are largely performed by the skin. For example, the skin provides protection for our bodies and a barrier to things like water loss, heat loss, infection, that kind of thing. In addition, the hair on the skin, as well as the skin's sensory receptors, allow the skin to sense our environment. In the dermal layer of the skin are blood vessels, and those blood vessels can dilate to release heat or constrict to retain heat, so the skin is involved with temperature regulation. Another thing that the skin can do is help with the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for healthy bone growth, and it's not just the skin that helps make vitamin D. There's a couple of other organs involved, and it's the keratinocytes that do that help make vitamin D. And lastly, the dermis of the skin is where muscles of facial expression are attached. So the muscles that make you smile or squint your eyes or wiggle your nose or squint, all of those different muscles, or frown, I guess, are attached on your skin. And therefore, they say that the skin is involved with facial communication or facial expression, either one. So we're going to look at these functions in a little bit more detail, particularly the protective function of the skin. So the skin forms a barrier to the loss or absorption of water, so water homeostasis. It also protects deeper organs from physical injury. There are cells in the skin that help protect deeper layers of the body from UV radiation. Even though the skin is exposed to the UV radiation, more vital organs won't be. And the skin provides a barrier to chemicals. Now, what's important about the water barrier reflects the structure of the skin. So the skin forms a water barrier because of three structures. One is a protein that the keratinocytes make, and that's keratin. The other is that the cells make these lipid vesicles that prevent water crossing. And then finally, between the skin cells are tight junctions. And if you recall, a tight junction does not allow material to pass in between cells. The sensory functions of the integumentary system we will talk about towards the end of the lecture in a little bit more detail. But in the dermis, we find what we call receptors that respond to certain stimuli. Now, in this case, a receptor isn't a single cell. Sometimes it's a single cell, but often it's a collection of cells wrapped by connective tissue. So it can be either, but it's not a single protein. It's not we don't use this term receptor the same as we've done in the past with cell membrane receptor. That's just a protein. This is a whole cell. So some of the stimuli that are detected by the receptors in the skin include pressure, stretch, touch, pain, and temperature. A little bit about temperature regulation. I want to mention that I think it's in your textbook that hair is thought to not be involved at all in temperature regulation. I disagree. I think that the hair on the scalp in particular prevents heat loss from the head, or it can be a site of heat release. You know how your hair gets a little sweaty when you work out or something like that. You sweat on your scalp. So I think the hair does do some insulation there, but it's neither here nor there really. It doesn't matter. The other structures involved with temperature regulation by the skin include the sweat glands and the blood vessels that are found in the dermis. So sweat is primarily composed of water, and water holds heat. Remember, it has a high heat capacity. So when sweat glands produce sweat, they release water, and the heat evaporates with the water on the surface of our body. It helps to cool the body. Now, the vessels can help with cooling the body or preventing heat loss, either way. So promoting heat loss to cool the body or preventing heat loss to retain heat. And the way they do this is by constricting and dilating. So vasoconstriction means that the blood vessel will become narrower, and vasodilation means that the blood vessel will become wider. So I have a picture to kind of explain this a little bit. You have to imagine that the internal organs are deep, like the heart, the stomach. Okay, they're deep, and the skin is superficial. And there's blood flowing from the interior of our body out to the periphery. So in this case, we'd have blood flow going towards the periphery. Now, blood is warm, very warm. And so when it reaches these capillaries that are in the dermis, heat is radiated across the skin. So you lose heat. However, in a condition called vasoconstriction, these capillaries constrict, and that reduces heat loss. So vasoconstriction reduces heat loss, keeping the blood warm for the internal organs, which is what happens when you go outside in January. Your skin blood vessels or capillaries constrict, as opposed to on a hot summer's day, when you go outside, those skin blood vessels will dilate. Now, vitamin D, as I mentioned, is required for normal bone formation, development, and just keeping it healthy. And the skin participates in making vitamin D. The keratinocytes have a precursor to vitamin D. And the liver and the kidneys are also necessary to get complete maturation of the vitamin D. So we'll talk about this more with the endocrine system, because it turns out that vitamin D is a hormone. And then I've already mentioned the last function of facial expression used for communicating. The skeletal muscles that you can voluntarily control, smiling and frowning, are attached to the dermis of your skin so that your skin moves when they contract to form different expressions. Okay, so now with a basic understanding of the structure of the skin, as well as functions of the integumentary system, we're going to look more closely at the epidermis. So the epidermis is composed of several layers. And what differs in these layers are what cell types are present and the maturation of the cells. So I'm going to start superficially. The top layer that you can see is called the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum has dead keratinocytes, and what's left over after these cells fracture are the keratin proteins, or bundles of keratin proteins, giving us a nice barrier protection. In addition, there are some lipid vesicles present in the stratum corneum. Now, underneath the stratum corneum is the stratum lucidum. Again, there are dead cells in the stratum lucidum, and they appear clear due to the fact that there's a protein in them called eladin. And we don't see this clear layer underneath the stratum corneum except in areas where our skin is very thick, right? So your palms, the heels of your feet, then the stratum lucidum will be quite thick. Beneath the stratum lucidum is the stratum granulosum, and these cells, keratinocytes still, have dark staining keratin granules. And so the stratum granulosum always appears darker than the other layers. Beneath that is the stratum spinosum, and it's named because the cells look spiny. At least the pink keratinocytes do. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a little bit. Then the deepest layer is the stratum basale, and the stratum basale has very young keratinocytes. There are also stem cells present, and this yellow one is supposed to show you a stem cell that's dividing. And there are melanocytes that produce a pigment that protects us from UV radiation. So these are melanocytes that make melanin. And then up in the stratum spinosum, I didn't mention before, but there are these dendritic cells, green, okay, and they help fight infection. So in the stratum basale, we have 4 different types of cells. We have the keratinocytes, the normal keratinocytes. We have stem cells. We have melanocytes, which make melanin. And then we also have these tactile cells. These cells are attached to a nerve ending, and so they detect pressure. When pressure gets as deep as the stratum basale, that triggers this tactile cell to send a signal to the nerve cell, which carries it through your nervous system. Now, the stem cells will replace any cells that are sloughed off of the most superficial layers of your skin. So throughout the course of the day, your body sloughs off stratum corneum cells. Those cells have to be replaced. And what happens is the cells in the stratum basale, the stem cells, divide, and they push up all the other cells. The other cells have to move out of the way. And so as a cell progresses towards the most superficial layer of your skin, it will eventually die because it gets farther away from the blood vessels that carry the nutrients, and those blood vessels are in the dermis. Now, the stratum spinosum looks spiny, for which it's named spinosum, because when the skin is prepared to look at under the microscope, it's dehydrated. They dehydrate it and then they stain it. So when the cells are dehydrated, they shrink a little bit. But in this part of the skin, this layer of the skin, the cells are joined together not just by tight junctions, but also by these strong desmosomes. And if you remember, desmosomes have many membrane proteins that keep the cells together, okay? So the desmosomes remain between the cells. They're so strong, they're not broken. But the cells shrink when they're dehydrated, so you can see the desmosomes. That's what makes the stratum spinosum appear spiny looking. In this region, there are also dendritic cells that can do phagocytosis of any kind of foreign pathogen. Now I want to talk a little bit about what's the difference between thick and thin skin. So you know this inherently. Some regions of your body, the skin is pretty thin. Other regions, it's quite thick. So thick skin is only found on your palms, your fingers, the surface that you touch with anyway, your soles of your feet and your toes. And the layer that's thickest is the stratum corneum. So right here, or is thicker, I should say, is the stratum corneum. So these two pictures show thick skin and thin skin. The thick skin is, of course, on the left. And the layer that's different between thick and thin is the stratum corneum. In the regions where we have thick skin, there aren't any hair follicles puncturing the epidermis, and there's no sebaceous glands. Now, sebaceous glands secrete sebum, which is an oily substance that provides a water barrier, but it also just moistens your skin. And everywhere else in your body, you have thin skin. There's no stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum isn't that thick. So just so you know, thick skin and thin skin, always the dermis is thicker, but they categorize thick versus thin based on the thickness in the epidermis. I've already mentioned this, but this slide shows you, or at least tells you, that as stem cells in the stratum basale divide, the daughter cells push up other cells that are already present. And so the keratinocytes that are pushed up, they're eventually going to reach the stratum corneum. So this is called migration of keratinocytes. And so they go from the basal layer to the stratum spinosum layer to the stratum granulosum. If the lucidum exists, it will be, go through there, and then the stratum corneum. As these keratinocytes ascend, just due to, space constraints from the stem cells continually producing new daughter cells, as they ascend, they mature. And what they're doing is making waterproof cells and keratin for the stratum corneum. It takes a month or 40 days for a cell from when it's born to migrate all the way up to the point where it's exfoliated or flakes off. So the keratinocytes make keratin. That's a big thing. It's a protein. When the cells die up at the top in the stratum corneum, the keratin bundles are left, and that helps provide a protective barrier. The other thing that keratinocytes do is they phagocytose melanin. That means they take up melanin and distribute it in their cytoplasm. Now, melanin was actually made by the melanocyte or melanocyte. So when the melanocyte makes melanin, the melanin is released, but the keratinocytes quickly take it up. And so the melanocytes will have this nice UV barrier distributed within their cytoplasm, and more accumulates as they progress to the surface, and that provides UV protection for us. Now let's talk a little bit about the water barrier. Most has been discussed, but I want to summarize it for you. Okay, so what makes up, I think skin's amazing that it's such a waterproof barrier. It's just the coolest thing. So first, down in the stratum spinosum as well as the stratum basale, there are desmosomes, okay? And there are still some desmosomes up at the stratum granulosum, but that breaks down pretty much when you get up to the stratum corneum. But anyway, desmosomes keep the cells adhered to one another. That doesn't necessarily mean it provides waterproof, because waterproof would mean a tight junction. And a desmosome, really there could still be substances leaking through cells. But it does keep the cells together, so we include it. In addition, the keratinocytes make keratin. That protein acts as a water barrier. And the keratinocytes make these lamella that contain lipids, and eventually, they're just little vesicles. Eventually, the keratinocytes release these vesicles and they come to exist in between cells. And this is an excellent water barrier because, as you know, lipids repel water. So that's another aspect of the waterproof barrier of skin. By the time the keratinocytes reach the stratum corneum, the cells are going to die, and they die because they are so far away from the nutrients, glucose, oxygen, that they need to survive. And that's because the blood vessels are in the dermis. In addition, the cells that reach the surface, the stratum corneum, are enveloped in a barrier of keratin and these lipid vesicles. So even if the nutrients could diffuse up here, it's hard to get into the cell. So what happens is exfoliation. The dead cells, as well as some of the keratin, is flaked off over time. And you may wonder why in some regions the stratum corneum forms calluses, like on the backs of your heels or corns. That increased thickness of the stratum corneum is due to the stem cells dividing more frequently. And that usually happens or is stimulated by mechanical stress, pressure. Okay, a little bit about melanin. Melanin is produced by those melanocytes that exist in the stratum basale. The melanin is released from those cells, and then the keratinocytes take it up into their cytoplasm. The reason melanin is beneficial is that it shields DNA from UV light. And UV light in high doses, of course, is carcinogenic, and it damages DNA. The other thing that melanin does is, since it's a pigment protein, it has a color, it contributes to skin color. There are different forms of melanin, different pigments, degree of darkness. And so there is a difference in skin color, which we know. Dark skin has more melanin production. Light skin has less melanin production. That's the most important thing. The other thing is, in dark skin, I guess the melanin breaks down more slowly, and in light skin it breaks down more rapidly. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hair, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands, and then we'll talk about sensory receptors. So in this picture, you can see a hair puncturing the epidermis, and it resides in what is called the hair follicle. And at the base of the hair is a matrix or a bulb. And the hair is made up of dead keratinocytes. That's what it's made up of. What I'd like to discuss in relation to hair are these sebaceous glands. So next to not every single hair, but many hairs, there is a gland with a duct that produces sebum. And sebum will travel in the duct and then coat the outside of the skin, providing moisture. Sometimes sweat glands are also associated with the hair follicle. So this is a picture of a sweat gland right here that has a duct that leads up to the hair follicle and again the surface of the skin. And obviously you know what sweat makes. So let's look at sebaceous glands first. Sebaceous glands, I want to ask you, are they considered endocrine glands or exocrine glands? They're making sebum. The sebum travels in a duct up to the epidermis to keep it from drying out. It also has some bactericidal agents. So I'm hoping you figured it out that this is an exocrine gland. Now let's talk a little bit about sweat glands. So sweat glands if I can get this slide to come up, there we go. Sweat glands are of two types. There are some that are associated with a hair follicle, and those are called apocrine sweat glands. And there are some that aren't, and they go direct, their duct goes directly to the skin surface without going through a follicle or to a follicle. These are called merocrine sweat glands. Merocrine sweat glands are all about temperature regulation, releasing sweat just to cool the body. That's supposed to say temperature. It's terrible. The apocrine sweat glands, on the other hand, I can just underline it here for you. The apocrine sweat glands, they secrete a thicker sweat that has fatty acids and pheromones within it. Pheromones are olfactory or smelling signals, and since the apocrine glands release this thick sweat with the pheromones to places where there's a hair, we see the apocrine glands more in the groin, the axilla, around the anus, and around the areola. Okay, so merocrine glands won't be associated with hair. And the way I remember the difference between the two is when I think apocrine, I think of an ape, and an ape has a lot of hair. So those glands are scent glands, and even though they're releasing some sweat as well. And merocrine glands are abundant on the palms, soles, and forehead, but in other places as well, and act to cool the body. Okay, so I'm going to go back up to our list of structures. We've talked about hair to a very minor extent, and that's okay. And we've talked about sebaceous glands and two types of sweat glands. And now we want to talk about this whole sensory idea of the skin. So first I'm going to show you a structure related to a hair follicle, and it's a muscle called the Erector Pili muscle. So the Erector Pili muscle is shown on this picture with a black arrow. And when that muscle, it's smooth muscle, you can't control it, voluntarily anyway. When that smooth muscle contracts, the hair follicle shifts and it causes the hair to stand upright, become erect. Now, what causes the muscle to contract? Usually it's the sympathetic nervous system, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is a nervous system that's kind of automatic and is activated in response to cold, fear, and touch. One reason this might have evolved, there's a couple of reasons, but one reason this might have evolved in humans is if the hair is erect, it will trap more heat. That will help prevent cold. In addition, it's thought that early mammals used it as a warning symbol for their predators. So if they became afraid because somebody was trying to kill them, I guess, they could look bigger by fluffing out their hair, kind of like the way birds fluff their feathers. Okay. The last thing to talk about are other sensory receptors in the skin, and they can be classified in different ways. So aside from the tactile cell, which is in the epidermis, all the other sensory receptors are located in the dermis, and we call them corpuscles or a hair receptor. Okay, so we're going to take a moment here to just delve into sensory information, which is really part of the nervous system, and talk about the different types of senses that we have. In our bodies, we have what are known as general senses, not in our bodies, but our bodies can sense stimuli that we consider general, and other stimuli we consider special. So we have both the ability to detect general and special stimuli. So we have receptors for each of those. Sensory receptors then are classified by kind of what it is they detect as well as where they are located. So general sensory receptors, touch, pressure, temperature, are going to be located in the skin. Also other places, muscles, tendons, joints, blood vessels, viscera, as you know if you've ever felt pain anywhere other than your skin. Now we also have receptors in our bodies for special senses, but these special senses include vision, hearing, equilibrium or balance, taste, and smell. All of the sense organs for these are located in the head and not associated with the skin. So we're going to be talking about just general senses here. Now the skin has different types of sensory receptors. Thermoreceptors detect temperature. Okay, the skin doesn't really have a photoreceptor. That would detect light. But it does have nociceptors that detect pain and chemoreceptors that detect chemicals. Finally, the skin has what are known as mechanoreceptors. These are the ones we're going to talk about, and they detect physical something, stimuli, vibration maybe, touch, pressure, stretch. So in the skin, we can detect general stimuli, and we are going to focus our attention on mechanical stimuli. Now the two basic types of receptors, mechanoreceptors, in the skin are free nerve endings or encapsulated nerve endings. So the tactile cell is an example of something being connected to a free nerve ending. Encapsulated nerve endings are the ends of neurons or neural cells wrapped in connective tissue, and these are all located in the dermis. They can detect various types of mechanical stimulation, as I mentioned previously. So let's look at a picture of these. Like we had the Erector Pili muscle that was attached to this hair follicle and could cause the hair to stand straight up. You know, that was the muscle. We also have a nerve ending or neuron ending attached to many of our hairs, so that if external stimuli like a breeze presses or pushes on that hair, this neuron is excited and it sends a signal. So that's an example of a free nerve ending. Another example would be the tactile cell that I mentioned before being associated with a free nerve ending right here. There's no connective tissue wrapping, it's just a single cell. Now the encapsulated sensory receptors located in the dermis are really complex. There's a Ruffini corpuscle, a Meissner corpuscle, and a Pacinian corpuscle. Let's look at the Meissner corpuscle first, upper right. Okay, there's nerve endings here wrapped in a connective tissue, but notice where it's located. It's right at the border between the epidermis and the dermis, so it makes sense that the Meissner corpuscle would respond to light touch. The Ruffini corpuscle is deeper, so it responds to heavy touch, and the Pacinian corpuscle the same, heavier touch. But the Pacinian corpuscle and the Ruffini corpuscle differ in how quickly they recover. And so the Pacinian's a little bit slower and it'll detect vibration, it'll detect subtleties. You don't really have to know about that. So if I go back up and I look at a picture here, you can see a Pacinian corpuscle that's quite deep. And you can see that the Meissner corpuscle is more superficial. They don't have a Ruffini in this picture. Well, that's the majority of the integumentary system. There's one more lecture on homeostatic imbalances like burns and cancer for the integumentary system. Thank you very much for listening.